As a New Jersey dispensary, we're opening our first store in New Jersey soon. I can advertise in billboards in Pennsylvania, but the medical dispensaries in Pennsylvania can't use out of home. It can be really frustrating. 30% of all legal cannabis that's sold in the United States is sold online right now. And it's probably actually a little bit higher. It's mainstream commerce. I think about 22% of it is done online in the United States right now. So cannabis actually trends significantly higher for online sales. If we were to move to Schedule 3, that 280E would go away. It would open up a lot of opportunity, not only on the marketing side, but just general cannabis, because all of a sudden you can deduct your packaging costs, your marketing costs, all these things that we've had no access to.
Our guest today is Jeremy Johnson, Chief Marketing Officer for Quality Roots, Michigan's premier cannabis company focused on retail and branding. Jeremy is a digital marketing professional that has fully transitioned into the cannabis space after a wide range of projects, from leading mobile and web development teams to managing tech installations for music festivals and other large-scale events. Cannabis has always been a part of his journey as a second-generation advocate and medical card holder at an early age. From 2020 to 2022, Jeremy helped lead the e-commerce and digital strategies for two of Michigan's highest volume dispensaries. And after a short stint on the software side, Jeremy is back to leading marketing for an 8-store chain of dispensaries based in Detroit. Jeremy Johnson, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Steve. Appreciate the intro.
You are very welcome, my friend. And I, for one, am very curious. I am not that familiar with this industry per se. I'm familiar with marketing, but not in this industry. And it's going to be a really interesting conversation, I think, or I know for myself and the viewers and listeners to really get into. I think there's still some of this. What does all this mean? And how can I learn from this industry? So I want to just start at the high level, digital marketing in cannabis. And we were talking offline, and it's educate everybody about up until a certain year, you could only advertise on Google when it came to cannabis. And now there's other options. Is that right?
Yeah, well, you couldn't advertise on Google.
You could advertise, right?
Yeah, so I think when most people think of digital marketing, one of the very first things that comes to mind is, Google that business. Do they come up?
Right.
Do you show up in the search results? Do you show up as a business listing? And I can't quite remember the exact timeline on it, but I think it wasn't until about 2012, maybe 2013, when Google finally allowed for cannabis businesses to list on their platform. So in the really early days of like Prop 215 out in California and legalization in Colorado, if you were a cannabis consumer and you were looking for a dispensary or a place to buy product at, you had to go to a specialized marketplace online to find that. So that was typically Weedmaps and Leafly.com, which both came out around 2008. But it took some time for the mainstream listing services to allow for cannabis. Now today, you can list on Google Maps, you can list on Apple Maps, you can even list on Yelp if you want to today as a cannabis business.
Are those developments recent where you can go on Google and Yelp?
Relatively. Google, I think it's been over 10 years now that you can list on, although access to certain levels of a business listing have increased over the years. There is now a dispensary category, for example, on Google. You used to just have to list as like a retail location. Now you can actually select cannabis business, which is really key. And Google, because of that, Google understands what a dispensary is, can provide. When people do search for it, they know that they're looking for a dispensary, not necessarily like a medical dispensary or like a pharmacy. So that differentiation is relatively new. And then Yelp, I'm not actually sure when they allowed it. And Apple Maps relatively recently, for sure.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, let's get a little more granular into specifically SEO. And you mentioned something to me about the difference between product-based SEO and dispensary SEO.
Yeah.
Let's start there. What's the difference?
Yeah. So that, and one of the interesting things about cannabis business marketing in general, but digital marketing, is there is no playbook. We can borrow from playbooks, but nobody's written that playbook before. Nobody really bought weed online until the pandemic when things were shut down, but cannabis businesses were declared essential. And so a lot of these terms and things that we use in our industry are, they're relatively, they're unique to us. And so what I categorize as a dispensary type search is somebody that's searching for weed near me, cannabis near me, dispensary near me, something really wide ranging that shows intent that like, hey, you're looking for a close place to buy products at. But then you have product related searches. So those might be a strain name, a brand name, or a product, a general type of product that people are searching for. So, a good example that kind of rolls it all into one is I might know that I love a certain brand of pre-rolls. A really popular one across the country is Jeter. So I might search for Jeter pre-rolls near me. And that's a product search. That's somebody who's like, I know exactly what I'm looking for. I just want to find the dispensary that carries it closest to me.
Gotcha. Okay. I read a really interesting article you wrote. I don't remember what it was, but it was titled 4 Ways to Improve Your Dispensary SEO Strategy.
Okay. Yeah.
And I'd love to dive a little deep into that because the 4 points that you call out are really applicable to any business.
Totally.
When it comes to improving SEO. And the first one was Google My Business, which essentially means, right, you make sure you have a complete and accurate, Google My Business profile. Yeah. So talking about, how does someone do that? What's the first step kind of thing?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. These apply to every other industry that we live in or operate in. So Google My Business is a listing service through Google, if you're not aware. And to get listed on there, you have to have a valid address. You have to have a phone number. You have to get verified by Google. Now, cannabis is a little bit interesting because it wasn't until recently that we got the cannabis business category for Google. But even so, if anybody out there has put up a Google business listing, you know that the verification can sometimes be difficult. Well, guess what? It's even more difficult in the cannabis world. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is you tend to have very interesting regulations at a state level, and there is no unified regulations across the United States for cannabis businesses. Everything's at the state level, right? So every state you operate in is different. Some of those state level regulations say that you can't use certain words in your business title. So there's even a state out there where it says you can't use the word dispensary. However, colloquially, consumers refer to it as a dispensary. So if all of a sudden you can't put dispensary in your business title, that might make it really difficult for Google to associate you correctly, right? And then the other really difficult thing about it is that when you do go to get verified on Google, you want to do it far enough in advance where on opening day, people are, you're on Google and people can find you. But the difficult thing about opening a dispensary is the local municipalities, and even sometimes at the state level, they might not notify you. They might say, hey, we'll give you your license sometime in the next 3 weeks. And so you're trying to work with Google to get verified, but you might not have anybody in store to pick up the phone and answer that verification call. Or maybe you went and opened your Google business listing 3 months ago, but you still haven't passed your state final, and Google takes it down because somebody reports it as closed. That has happened to me more times than I would like to admit. We thought we would be open in April, and then turns out we didn't open until December because of state licensing. So you end up having to manage a lot going on there. And then obviously being a cannabis business, you're more prone to being taken down for certain content. You're also more prone to competition reporting you. I've had competitors create a listing right next to mine, get that verified, and then report mine as a duplicate just to get it taken down. Wow. And that's how fierce cannabis marketing can be sometimes.
Yeah, that's pretty cutthroat. Wow. So the first way to improve SEO is Google My Business. The second one that you denoted in the article is on-page SEO.
Yeah, again, pretty crucial to any business that you're doing. I think in general, SEO tends to be fairly more crucial for cannabis businesses than some other businesses. When we talk about on-page, again, I would break it down into 2 main categories for dispensaries. You have your general content about your dispensary, where you're located, maybe the towns you're in. If you're in multiple ones, you want to have a location page for each town or city that you're located in. And then you also have on-page content when it comes to the products. And so, I break it down into 2 types, and there's really two main parts of your website. You have your overarching website that talks about who you are, what you do, maybe the brands that you carry, but then you also have the commerce section of your website. And these, oddly enough, in cannabis, these are usually two different systems, CMSs, that manage these things. Whereas in like, a general D2C world or even a retail experience online, you're just using Shopify to manage all this content. So that gets a little more complicated in the cannabis world where you're having to manage content in two different systems. But those are the two focuses for on-page SEO.
Okay. Yeah. And you mentioned the next one, which was menu and product SEO. But then the last one, off-page SEO. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. So this is something I think you know a lot about. There's a lot of different aspects of off-page SEO. A big one is going to be your backlinks and how well your website is connected to the rest of the internet. I really love the focus of what I call local PR, essentially, for cannabis, because cannabis is so localized, and oftentimes you will have municipalities that either limit or outright ban dispensaries. It can be a really hot topic in communities, especially smaller ones. So, while that can be detrimental on some sides, it's really good for building backlinks, because if you get a dispensary open in your municipality, or if a law passes, or if something's being considered, you can get a lot of press around that. And then you can also be viewed as the authority in the space. So anytime a cannabis news story happens, in my neck of the woods, I've got TV6, I've got a local Fox channel, I've got all these, I've got the Mining Journal newspaper. Typically, if you've built a good relationship with these people, they're reaching out to you and giving you a backlink every time there's a cannabis related story. And I think that's incredibly powerful. It's also contextual for Google. Google is saying, hey, they're being listed by the TV6 station here in Marquette, Michigan, and they're a Marquette, Michigan business. I'm going to give that higher priority for those local searches. So for off-page, I really encourage you to focus on smaller, as a cannabis business, smaller publications. Not to say that if you get a link in, Forbes or the New York Times, it's not going to be powerful, but it's a lot more easy to get them in that small world. And it's also, there's a novelty to it. If something happens to somebody in the tree business, maybe that doesn't make the local news. But if it's about cannabis and your state just legalized, you could probably make the local news pretty easy.
That's a good point. It's a really good point. So I'm very curious. I know that I think we all know, at least I shouldn't assume, that there are state-by-state restrictions within this industry that don't come into play with, I can't think of any other industry off the top of my head, right? So what types of marketing, tactics, channels are allowed? Yeah,
it very much varies by state. I'll give you a couple concrete examples just to help break it down, but let's talk about out of home for just a second. So out of home in Michigan is probably one of the most relaxed state regulations we have in the cannabis industry. If you drive through Detroit, Metro Detroit, you will see cannabis billboards every other billboard, for example. You will see planes flying through the skies with cannabis messages. You will see mobile billboards, trucks for hire. You'll see it all in Detroit. And even northern Michigan, where it's a little more like sparse, you'll still see these advertisements. Local municipalities have tried to limit that a little bit in some cases, but there's really not a whole lot they can do. You can't, when it comes to signage, municipalities really can't censor the content of the signs for the most part. They can only kind of censor the when and where of signage. And so a lot of that defaults to state laws. So Michigan's very open. However, there are certain states that have just straight up banned cannabis advertising. So I'm actually drawing a blank thinking of like one that's holistically banned it. But what ends up happening is the ban usually happens at the organizational level of the org that monitors cannabis. So in Ohio, for example, or Minnesota, for example, their cannabis government unit says, hey, as a cannabis business, you cannot advertise on billboards. And then they if they do, they run the risk of losing their license. So another really interesting example of how this ends up working out, as a Michigan cannabis business, the Minnesota Cannabis Regulatory Authority, they call it the OCM there, Office of Cannabis Management, has no jurisdiction if I advertise my cannabis business in Minnesota. But the local Minnesota companies cannot advertise.
Wow.
So you end up with a really weird situation. Pennsylvania is another one where, as a New Jersey dispensary, we're opening our first store in New Jersey soon. I can advertise in billboards in Pennsylvania, but the medical dispensaries in Pennsylvania can't use out of home.
As a traditional marketer, like I can't, it doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. And it can be really frustrating. For me, I love it though, because I love being able to, I think it's fun to work inside of a box and find a way to get outside of that box. Yeah. And so it's just so much fun when I find a way to get a message out to our customers, but everybody else is like, oh, we can't do it. Well, I guess, a lot of people won't even try because they think it's too hard,
Yeah, that's true. Hey, sorry for the interruption. We're going to get back to our show in one quick second, but stay with me. If you're in the need for anything SEO and or link building related, you need to do yourself one quick favor. You need to go to the website that's on the screen right now, stanventures.com. Go there, tell them Steve-O sent you. The rest will take care of itself. Trust me. You can thank me later. A question about, so you were talking about out of home, right? But what about like digital online marketing? Yeah. Can you market? Or is it based on IP address? Like you can't market to someone in a different state?
Yeah. It really is up to the media platform. I remember when I really first started digging into digital marketing in cannabis, late 2019 was when I kind of was getting started. We were opening our first recreational dispensary with the group I was with in Michigan. And I started digging around. We got our website up and running. And then I started looking at okay, what kind of programmatic advertising can I do? What kind of retargeting can I do if I have somebody's email address, all these kinds of things. And, most of the big players in late 2019, early 2020 wouldn't touch it. Now, there were a few cannabis specific players. There's one out there called Surfside that does programmatic advertising across a wide range of digital media properties. I remember the first time I connected with these guys, I was like, oh, this is amazing. Like, I'm so glad I found somebody that's doing this in cannabis. I want to target everybody in Green Bay, Wisconsin, and just hit them with digital ads. And they're like, well, wait a minute. You're a Michigan dispensary. Cannabis isn't legal in Green Bay, and I'm like, I know. And they're like, well, we can't do that. And they were very worried about it at the time. But I was like, I pushed back. I was like, well, why can't you do that? They're like, well, our legal counsel says no. But I think over a 6 to 8 month period, I worked with those guys and they worked with their legal team to kind of come to the realization that there were really no major issues with it from a legal standpoint for them to be doing that. So that opened up programmatic ads for me in that area. Same thing with out of home digital boards that you see in restaurants or venues. I could blanket every digital board in a restaurant within a 5-mile radius of the Green Bay Packers football stadium during Sundays if I wanted to, because I worked with those property owners of that digital media to make sure it was, it mostly had to be rewritten at their org level rather than at the state level, because most states don't have anything prohibiting it, but most organizations will have some sort of caveat in their terms of service that say, hey, our service can't be used to market anything that is federally illegal. And so oftentimes it just takes that going back and looking at it and say, hey, this has really become a states' rights thing. And if the state doesn't prohibit it, then we're going to allow it on our platform.
It's fascinating. I mean, it's absolutely fascinating. Messaging. What kind of messaging resonates with customers?
Yeah. It depends on your market. Regionality is really big in cannabis, but it also depends on the time that your market has been around. So to give you a very basic answer, states like Michigan, Colorado, California tend to be more mature markets. And unfortunately, sometimes what that means is that pricing becomes the crux of all messaging. And so, we're the last couple of years in Michigan, I'd say the last 2 years, we've been in a situation where a lot of the value that companies are trying to show customers is in that pricing world. You'll see billboards that say $17 eighths. You'll see billboards that say, free product for first time customers. And that's really worked for for the last 2 years in Michigan. But I think that at a certain point, that type of messaging becomes so saturated where every time you see a billboard that says free weed, you're like, yeah, whatever. But I know it comes with a caveat. And I'd rather just go to the dispensary down the street for me because it's more convenient. So you have that as a very interesting messaging world. But then you also have things that resonate with customers. It is a natural product after all. And so I think where you can get more in depth with it is on packaging for brands. People want things that are organic. People also want, and this is where you have to be careful, but they want desired effects. There's this whole movement right now, especially with the edibles and drinks, to push for products that give you a specific effect, whether it's like a sleep aid or a more social thing. There's a really amazing D2C brand in the hemp space right now that's killing it on digital marketing called, I never know how to pronounce it, but it's BREZ. I want to say it's Breeze, but maybe it's Brez. I don't know. But you'll see their ads on Meta. You'll see their ads on TikTok. And their whole messaging is just all about like, hey, we're a cannabis social drink that can replace alcohol. Don't want to worry about the hangover in the morning, but you want to have a fun night, drink Breeze, Wow. And so that kind of messaging really tends to resonate with customers, especially the people that might not be totally familiar with cannabis. Maybe they tried it in college, but they haven't tried it in 10 or 15 years. That's what draws those people back in.
It's like a re-education too of like, it's not your father's cannabis kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, it depends on the form factor, but even the flower, it's not, it's not the same. There's more than just THC percent in price to look at. There's terpene profiles. There's potential desired effects that you can look at. There's flavor profiles too that people identify with,
Right. It's fascinating. I want to make sure we cover this before we wrap up. The future, right, of legal cannabis and Schedule 3 and what that all means for marketers.
Yeah. Well, another thing that people might not be, that's a really big topic, number one, and we can dig into it more if you want. But what a lot of people in the mainstream world might not be totally aware of is that because cannabis is a Schedule 1 drug currently, we do not have the ability to take the same tax deductions that other businesses have. If you're curious, you can look up under the IRS tax code rule 280E. And that's what prohibits us from a lot of those protections that other businesses have. But a great concrete example of what that means is I can't write off my marketing expenses for everything I do. So right now, marketing teams are very limited because of that. I can't, if I had $1 million budget and I could write that down on my taxes, different story, right? Just like every other business. But as it stands today, marketing tends to be looked at even more kind of strictly as a cost center rather than a revenue generating center in cannabis because you don't have that tax freedom there. So if we were to move to Schedule 3, that 280E would go away. Schedule 280E applies to both Schedule 1 and 2 drugs, but does not apply to Schedule 3 drugs. So that's a big thing that you'll probably hear a lot about in the cannabis world. It would open up a lot of opportunity, not only on the marketing side, but just general cannabis, because all of a sudden you can deduct your packaging costs, your marketing costs, all these things that we've had no access to. There's actually a lawsuit happening right now at the federal level that's being led by TrueLeave out of Florida and I think a group out of Massachusetts, if I recall correctly. If you're interested in it, look that lawsuit up and you can learn more there. But in general, if that opens up, I think that really changes the marketing landscape. You'll probably see more talent come in from outside of cannabis too. Because if you have somebody that's really talented in retail or brand marketing, but they know that in cannabis, they're going to have a limited budget, maybe they don't want to enter the space yet. But all of a sudden, if that opens up, you're probably going to have a rush of talent in. It might just be more accepted too. And then I think the big thing overarching that is the future for cannabis marketing is just the focus on digital. I don't have the numbers right in front of me, but a really good example, and I presented this at MJ BizCon last year, which is coming up in a couple of weeks here for 2024. Cannabis is actually ahead of the curve in online sales compared to mainstream products. About 30% of all legal cannabis that's sold in the United States is sold online right now.
Wow.
And it's probably actually a little bit higher. It's hard for me to estimate that. That's my conservative estimate, where I think last year Bloomberg ran an article, and I forget who they quoted. Somebody should probably double check this on me and make sure I'm talking about it right. But I think mainstream commerce, I think about 22% of it is done online in the United States right now. So cannabis actually trends significantly higher for online sales. And a lot of the cannabis platforms that are being developed for e-commerce have features that are above and beyond what you have in mainstream. Like if you look at a cannabis e-commerce software versus a Shopify, the things that are a non-negotiator in cannabis, Shopify still doesn't even have some of those features, which is really interesting. So I think over time, as cannabis becomes more accepted and more states legalize, and as more technology gets developed specifically for cannabis, you will see a convergence of marketing techniques and technology from the cannabis space that kind of move over to mainstream and overlap.
Interesting. Crystal ball. What do you think happens?
With what?
We'll go schedule 1 or 2. Will it get more accepted? Why it's, just
yeah.
Talk about the future. Where do you see it going?
Yeah, I mean, I really am a big believer in incremental change personally.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the industry would prefer straight federal legalization or decriminalization. I think that's probably unreasonable knowing our government. And I do believe Schedule 3 will happen. I think that becomes a little bit more difficult with the incoming administration. Although, some of the appointees that have been talked about so far, like an RFK, seem to be relatively pro-cannabis, pro-psychedelics, pro-alternative medicine. I still think it, if it was a more blue administration coming in, I think we'd have a better chance of that happening. But the DEA has officially delayed that decision until 2025, when there is a new admin. So we'll see what happens in that DEA hearing. It will be really interesting. But then beyond that, I think the best chance of any incremental change is really through a judicial avenue. And that's if you look up that True Leave lawsuit that was filed, I think earlier this year. It's the same group that took on the gay marriage legalization case. So Flexner, Schiller, and Boyes, if I recall correctly. And they're the ones that took gay marriage all the way to the Supreme Court and got it legalized there. And it's the same legal group that's backing the lawsuit. And if you had to ask me my opinion, I would say the most likely catalyst we'll get is through judicial action beyond Schedule 3. Got
it. Well, listen, we're up against it, Jeremy. What an absolutely fascinating conversation. Thank you for sharing your insights into this industry that I know a lot of marketers, just people in general, are not that familiar with. So thank you again for your time.
Yeah, thank you for your time. And if you are a marketer and you want to learn more about the cannabis space, surprisingly, LinkedIn is one of the most cannabis-friendly social media platforms. So get on LinkedIn. There's anybody in the cannabis space is probably posting on there, and it's a really niche and easy community to get involved with.
Great tip. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Hey, I'm the guy from the video you just saw. Thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Now do yourself a favor. If you haven't already, subscribe to our content. Believe it or not, unconfirmed rumors and reports, you will see an increase in 20% in organic traffic just by subscribing. Okay, maybe not, but it's fun, right? But do yourself a favor, really. Subscribe to our content. You won't be sorry. Thanks.